it was quite eerie because there was this pile of smoke going up, and of course you couldn't get that near the train, but I was able to. And all the rescue services were there, and there had been a head-on crash between the Cheltenham Flyer, which was a Great Western train, which was travelling about 90 miles an hour, and the little Thames Turbo, who was chugging out of Paddington.
Welcome to All in All Stations, the Transport Podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, we've got a bit of a special edition today, haven't we?
Yes, hello Christian, and hello to our listeners. It is a bit of a special. It's an exclusive interview that you've recorded with Gerald Corbett, who formerly was the Chief Executive of Railtrack during the early days of rail privatisation. And you talked to Gerald about his time in that role and some very significant developments and changes that took place in Britain's railway industry during that period. Now, in fact, over a quarter of a century has passed since Gerald Corbett was Chief Executive of Railtrack. And although some of the events from that time live for people like you and me as if they were only yesterday, I think it's important just to do a little bit of a historical recap, perhaps for some of our younger listeners.
Yes, indeed. I lived through that period. I just left the independent newspaper. I was a freelance writing for my rail column and also writing for all sorts of people about the events of the time, and of course doing lots of television and radio. And you were working for some of the railway organisations.
Well, prior to that, you see, before and during rail privatisation, I was working for the RMT union, and I was responsible for representing primarily the interests of railway workers during the passage of the 1993 Railways Act. And then later in the 90s, I found myself in consultancy working for some of the businesses and trade associations that had emerged from privatisation.
So you were doing exactly what you're about to do now, which is to explain the very complex privatisation that emerged out of that legislation.
Yes, so here's a very, very brief potted history of the time. So in 1992, the Conservative Party, to general surprise, was re-elected as the government of the United Kingdom under the leadership of Prime Minister John Major. And he had also, to some people's surprise, included in his manifesto a pledge to privatise Britain's railways. And that involved breaking up and selling off what had hitherto been an integrated single national railway business, British Rail, operating under the British Railways Board. And this was achieved by the passage primarily of an Act of Parliament, the Railways Act of 1993. Now, although it was a very, very complicated process that turned one company into perhaps as many as 200 companies, the main feature of privatisation was the separation of the management of the trains from the management of the track. The train operations were broken up between 25 passenger train companies that were created, and also a number of freight train companies. But the infrastructure, everything essentially that didn't move, the track, the stations, the power supplies, the signalling, the depots, was put into one very large company which operated under the name of Railtrack. Now, it was expected that although all the other businesses would be sold to the private sector, Railtrack would continue to operate in the public sector as a nationalised business. But during the process of the legislation going through, the government changed its mind and decided to sell Railtrack as one of the big flotations where shares were sold to the public, which was a fashionable thing to do at the time. It had happened already with various other utilities such as gas and water and
It was the only
electricity.
bit of the railway that actually got sold in that way, wasn't it?
It was.
That went on the stock
Everything else
exchange.
either was sold as a franchise or sold as what they called a trade sale, where it was then essentially sold to another company. So Railtrack was this huge organisation in the private sector, and Gerald Corbett became the chief executive of Railtrack. And Gerald has produced a book called When Something Happens, which tells the story of his career, including that time as chief executive of Railtrack. And Christian, you have interviewed Gerald. Now, before we go into this, we should just say that the interview with Gerald includes discussion of some truly awful accidents that occurred on Britain's railways around about the turn of the century. And there will be people listening to this podcast, people like you and I, actually, Christian, who in various ways lived through that period and have memories and varying degrees of pain and anxiety, perhaps going back to that period. So I think it's just worth saying before we run the interview that that is the case, and we try to deal with these issues in the discussion, nevertheless, as sensitively as possible.
I'm with Gerald Corbett, who was chief executive of Railtrack between 1997 and 2000, a particularly turbulent period for the rail industry. And he has now written a book, When Something Happens, which has 6 chapters on his time in the railways, which are very revealing and very interesting. So I thought we'd invite Gerald to be on this podcast and give us some of the background to those tumultuous events. So thank you for being on Calling All Stations, Gerald. Tell me, first of all, why did you end up in the rail industry? You had no rail history. You'd had a career in business, but you ended up in the rail industry as CEO of Railtrack.
Yes, I'd after university, I was a management consultant and went to business school, and then basically had a finance career. I was a finance director at Dixon's Group, and then at Redden, which was a building materials company, so completely different to Dixon's. And then I was finance director of Grand Metropolitan. And Grand Metropolitan was a very big company, number 10 in the FTSE, employed
Hotels and things, yeah.
Yes, and it employed 80,000 people, and we merged with Guinness in 1997 to create Diageo. And when you do a merger,
Terrible name, I always thought, Diageo, but there we are.
not guilty. But it was a fantastic move for both companies. And when we announced the merger, the shares shot up by 20%.
Okay.
And the shares were then a £5, and they reached their peak last year, 25 years ago, at nearly 40 quid. So it did work really well.
You should have tipped me off to invest in it. But anyway, so why the rail industry then?
Well, but at that point, I'd been a finance director of 2 big companies, and I'd been financial controller of Dixon. So I'd sort of cracked the finance gig. And I could have done another finance directorship. There were 4 available at the time: Barclays, SmithKline Beecham, Marconi, and one other. I could have done another one. But I wanted to be a chief executive because that is the job where you have the most capacity to influence things, to shape things, and to make a difference. And that interested me. There was, and the reason I was leading was because Grand Met had the chief executive of Diageo, and that meant that the finance director had to come from Guinness. So Fillier became the finance director. So I had to find another job. And there was one chief executive available of a little company called Hepworth's in the Midland, and the other one was Railtrack, which was a new gig. And of course, in business, if you've had a sort of finance background, it doesn't really matter whether it's trains or it's video recorders or it's booze or it's bricks and blocks of concrete. It's a business. So I was, although I hadn't any general management experience, I had been around the block quite a bit. as a finance director, and I understood about public companies. I understood about
So they approached you, or you approached?
yes,
A headhunter.
yes, Caroline Eady, who's Michael Portillo's wife, and was a big cheese at Spencer Stewart, approached me. And an old friend from Cambridge, Archie Norman, who
was the MP, and
yes, he was the MP then, and he turned around Asda. He was on the nomination committee, which was chaired by Philip Beck, who was one of the non-executive directors who'd been chairman of Molin. And I was put on the list and put through my paces and all the rest of it. And it was a fascinating brief, because the railway had been split into all these different bits. Railtrack was effectively half of the railway. Commercializing it was considered a big opportunity. We had a massive program for regenerating all these stations, which required a great deal of investment.
2,500 stations you were supposed to do up, I think. I seem to remember.
Yes, and people have forgotten that actually we did that.
Right.
And we completed that all quite successfully.
Now, this is before it was privatised. It was in the process of being privatised.
No, it had been by the John Edmonds, who was a railway lifer, was the chief executive. And he'd been chief executive. He'd been in BR for 40 years or something. And he was the chief executive at the privatisation. And his chairman was Bob Horton, who was had been the chairman for 4 or 5 years. He'd been chief executive of BP, and he had quite a reputation. He was known as Hatchet Horton.
I met him, and he was a pretty sharp guy. But yes, and he was the one who as you explained in the book, who actually pushed for it to be privatised.
Yes, the railway privatisation was one of the final shoes to drop. Mrs. Thatcher had been against it. The Treasury was all for it, and there were various ways in about the early 1990s. Funny enough, when Portillo was transport minister or involved in it, there were various ways of privatizing the railway that were looked at.
Yes,
and Bob got and the initial ideas in the early 1990s were that Railtrack would not be privatized.
Yeah.
But the train operators, running the trains, would be pulled out of BR, and that would be how it would be.
Then it got sold off on Bob Horton's instigation.
Well, Bob came from the from BP, and yes, he did.
He persuaded it was him who persuaded the Treasury to set it up, basically.
He did, but it wasn't to sell Railtrack off. Yes, he did, but he was pushing in an open door. The Treasury were nervous about setting Railtrack off, because the railway subsidy then was about 3 or 4 billion a year, and most of that went into the track and the infrastructure. And the idea of privatizing something that still required so much government money was difficult.
Which is why Mrs. Thatcher never did it.
Which is one reason why Mrs. Thatcher never did it. And also, she understood the politics of it. 3 million people a day go on the bloody railways.
Yes.
And when they don't work, everybody knows all about it. But Bob persuaded the Treasury that Railtrack could be privatised and could be sold for several hundred million, and the Treasury quite liked the idea of that, and he pushed that through. And then the guilt on the gingerbread was to also, at the same time as it was privatized, to outsource the maintenance, to sell the maintenance companies.
Right.
And running the infrastructure employed about 30,000 people, 20,000 of whom were involved in the maintenance of the track. And Bob persuaded the Treasury to sell those companies. Split into different companies, and to sell them, and that would realize tens of millions. I think it realized 60 or 70 billion. Right. But even more fundamentally, that would take the union problem away from the government and away from the Treasury.
Okay, so you arrived there after this had all taken place. The maintenance had gone. The maintenance was private.
Yeah.
It's an entirely private company. Listed in the
stock. That's right. It had been private. The first shares had been sold just under a year after I.
Okay, so you arrived there, and what do you think of it? You knew nothing about the railway. Presumably, you kind of
I thought, it was a huge challenge, and there was a lot of energy being given to thinking through the cultural differences between BR and what we'd have to do, and there was a lot of investment that would have to be made. But it was an exciting time. It had been privatized, and it was only in the first few months that I began to fully appreciate what I'd taken on. And of course, you do when you join.
Right, in terms of how difficult it was.
Yes.
And what were the difficulties?
Well, let's the difficulties. First of all, as Railtrack owned the assets. We were in charge of the assets. We were the asset manager. But 20 of the 35,000 people that were employed in running the assets under BR, 20 of them now work for construction companies,
Right.
which had a completely
For BC and Amy and all the
parallel and all of that, which beat to a completely different rhythm. And they were tied to Railtrack by these contracts. And so all our expertise in terms of people was now on asset outsourced, was sort of effectively, I'm simplifying it to make the point, was outsourced into these construction. And what information there was gone into
about the asset.
Yeah.
So much about that in the book.
Right. Yeah. So putting it terribly simply, we were an asset management company without the information
About your assets.
about the assets, and without the people who had previously managed large portions of a large amount of the assets. And that was a fundamental flaw. Now, at one level, it made it easier because you only employed 10,000 people rather than 30,000 people, and you didn't have the union problems. And those 20,000 people that had been outsourced were all railwaymen, and the contracts weren't too bad, and it sort of worked. But they were driven by saving costs to make profit. Every year, the amount of money they got under these contracts diminished. So they were looking for efficiencies the whole time. And that was a problem because, of course, the great thing that privatization brought was a huge increase in the volume of the traffic. The railway suddenly, within 5 years, was 30% bigger. So you had
in terms of people's numbers.
In terms of numbers of passengers, number of passenger trials, and more trains, all the rest of it. And when the privatization was done, the economic architecture was set up. No one took that into account. So these maintenance companies were being cut back to the bone with the amount that they were getting.
And yet they had more maintenance to do.
And yet the track was being more trains were thundering over the track, and it was being hammered. And that was a big problem. And the way we did debate, should we take it back in-house? But we thought no, because it would be suddenly we had all kinds of other challenges as well. We'd be taking back 20,000 people. But we came up with a new form of contract, a much tighter, what you call an open book contract that enabled sharing of information and team working and so on and so forth. And we, as the maintenance contracts matured, we were replacing them with this new contract. Now, what happened ultimately, after 10 years, the maintenance was all taken back. And it was, looking back on it, a huge mistake to take the maintenance out of
right. Okay.
So that was one shoe that had to. That was one big problem. The second big problem was all the extra volume, which was good news, but none of us were set up to cope with it in terms of our economics. That was a big challenge.
And of course, the train operators were incentivized to have more trains and more use, whereas the maintenance company put costs on them, which they could.
And the same with us. That was
and with you, yeah.
And that was a huge tension. That they wanted to add trains, and of course you add more trains, and you get given less money, and that is a nightmare for punctuality and running the thing properly. And that was a big tension.
Because access charges were going down every year.
Access charges were going down every year. And the economic architecture hadn't aligned the incentives between the different parties. And that was one thing we did make quite a bit of progress on initially. And we figured out what should happen to the economic architecture. And the regulator eventually took the point. And in the 3 years into my reign, so to speak, in the regulatory review, the new regulatory regime reflected that and aligned the incentives, so we would get a share of the growth, as well as the train operators. So there was some progress on that, but the first 3 years there wasn't any of that.
And then we're slightly jumping ahead because then there was Labrick Road.
Well, just on the privatisation, but the other big thing was the West Coast Main Line,
Of course.
because in the prospectus of the privatisation, we were going to spend $2 billion on upgrading the West Coast Main Line on this fancy new moving block signalling, which is how you get the train from Terminal 1 to Terminal 2 at Gatwick works like that.
Right,
But
it's rather easier than, and the DLR works like that. But
that's not 450 miles going up to Glasgow.
You're rather funny in your book about Professor Brian Mellett, who was, of course, the person who was pushing this moving block technology, and which was bought by the government, which thought, yes, this is a great idea. We're going to let the contractor Virgin on the basis of this moving block technology.
Yes.
And of course, no line in the world, as you wrote in the book, no line in the world that was a complex kind of railway like the West Coast Main Line had ever used this technology.
No.
And still, 30 years later, still hasn't.
No, that's right. I can remember Brian explaining this all to me, and
saying it was all easy.
Yeah, that's right. Within 5 years, there wouldn't be any line-side signals on the West Coast Main Line, and there wouldn't be any drivers. It would all be and there'd be a sort of computer in the cab, and I said, well, presumably this will be phased in, Brian, and he said no. I said, well, so what's going to happen? He said, no, we'll just do it all at once. So I said, well, in one day, he said, we'll flick the switch. I said, that's incredible. But one of the problems
you think about people in Railtrack who must have been saying, Gerald, we think it's a bit more difficult than that, or they're sold on this crazy idea.
Well, the problem is, if you put that in your prospectus and you floated and you sold yourself for billions of pounds to new groups of shareholders on the basis you're going to do, and Brian had convinced the board, and there were engineers on the board, and they all believed this, and they believed that it was feasible and everything. And then you arrived from Grand Metropolitan, which, as you said, we had burgers and we were selling Smirnoff and everything. So I wasn't really in that strong a position in my early days in saying, look, this is complete nonsense. And although it was going to cost $2 billion, we weren't going to spend the $2 billion, because the work initially was on speccing it out and getting I realized that we could change to the old technology and do it, but it would cost a lot more. So which is what ended up happening. Right, but that was a problem. And then the way the train operators were sold off. Again, we had these contracts, and we had a system for attributing minutes delay to the and there was a thing called the performance regime, and monies flowed as a result. And it's good in one sense, because if you improved the punctuality of your bit, our bit was the infrastructure, you got more money, and we did pretty well at that. And the train operators, if they improved it as well, they would get some benefit of that. But actually, they got far more benefit from adding more trains. So they were far more interested in that, which of course is a disaster for the infrastructure of minutes delay. And we had 300 people in a building attributing minutes delay and arguing about it. And everything. And actually you could make far more money out of being good at arguing about the minutes delay attribution than running the bloody train set better.
Right.
So whereas under the old system, the integrated system, which is how most railways are run, everyone was working together to optimize the whole. Under the new system, where we were all split into 100 different bits, everyone was fighting their corner and trying to make more money out of these bloody contracts. So the thing was very difficult.
Okay, and then
we made progress.
But you set out of your book in some of the performance improved and so on, but then you got Labrick Road, and that really kind of coloured really the rest of your time at Railtrack, didn't it?
We were beginning to make progress. Yeah, we'd improved punctuality of the infrastructure by some 40%. We doubled the investment. We'd rescued the Channel Tunnel rail link, which was a big thing politically because Labour needed that.
Although eventually Railtrack didn't get that. I mean,
we did phase 1, but my successors decided not to do phase 2, which I think was a mistake.
Right.
because by moving towards Labour had been against the privatisation, as you know, and they didn't think it was a good idea, and any problem, any delayed train was a political issue, and money for the railways and profits and everything. Right. So and that was a shadow. And we'll come to the importance of that in Ladbroke Grove. That was a shadow over the whole thing, and we realised pretty quickly that although they wanted to characterise Railtrack, us, as the problem, we had to be part of the solution and work with them. And although we would never be their best friends, if we could be part of the solution, right, and everything, then there could be a future. So rescuing the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, and doing that for them
got you brownie points. So particularly with John Prescott, who was pretty
around with Blair and with everybody, and it showed us working. And then we were working we were the preferred bidder on the tube, because if you remember, the tube was going to be privatised, and that enabled us. The fact we'd done the CTRL, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link Phase 1. And that gave us the credibility to become the preferred supplier for the tube.
Although that didn't happen.
Although that did, because of Ladbroke Grove, which we'll come to.
Right.
So all the politics was sort of moving in our direction.
And you warmed to Prescott, didn't you? At first you were very critical of Prescott, but in the book you kind of say, he was pretty good at...
He was what he was, and there were some things he was very good at. But there were some. We had Gus MacDonald was excellent. The civil servants were strong. Number 10 was very strong. As Ladbroke Grove, the train crash was in October 1999. I'd done 2 years by then, and at that moment, actually, everything looked quite good because we'd improved punctuality, which everyone was pleased with. We saved the Channel Tunnel Rail Link. We're in line for the tube. Our profits had doubled or something. Our share price was 50 quid, and we'd only floated at £3.90. So our investors were happy, and it was all moving in the right direction. And then we had Ladbroke Grove.
Right. So yes, how did you hear about Ladbroke Grove, and what was your first? What first happened?
I was on my way to an industry meeting at the Savoy, where the regulator was going to speak. I was going to speak. Morton was going to speak. And at about 20:08,
Alistair Morton,
who was chairman of the Strategic Rail Authority, he was a very good bloke.
Yeah.
I got this call saying that there'd been this really bad crash and at Ladbroke, 8:03. And we, in those days, chief executives had a thing called a driver. So we diverted to Ladbroke Grove. We were going into the Savoy. And we got there at about 10:09. And I rang Morton up, and he already heard. And it was quite eerie, because there was this pile of smoke going up, and of course you couldn't get that near the train because, but I was able to. And all the rescue services were there, and John Curley, who was one of my right-hand men, he was there, and he told me roughly they thought it was as bad, and
signal past the danger.
Signal past the danger. There had been a head-on crash between the Cheltenham Flower, which was a Great Western train, which was travelling about 90 miles an hour. And the little Thames Turbo, who was chugging out of Paddington. The crash was 2 miles out of Paddington. They head-on crash. It was ghastly. There was something that I could do. The rescue services were coping with it. So I went off to the office, and I got to the office about 10 o'clock. And already the boardroom had been commandeered by Chris Lair, who was our very experienced operations director. And that had become a sort of control room for dealing with all the issues around the crash and everything. The crash was on a Tuesday, and everything. And I remember Chris telling me that there's 3 phases with what happens with the train crash. First of all, in terms of the news is what's happened is a big thing. And then it moves on to why did it happen? You can see this with the Spanish train crash, as we've just been through. Why did it happen? And then the third thing, of course, is who's to blame.
Right.
And then it's a very difficult moment for a train company because everyone's shocked. It is clearly terrible. Some people find it very difficult to keep going. And if you're one of the leaders, you do have to, because it affects how you feel, but you do have to keep everybody going and give a sense of direction and a sense.
And because you have to remember the railways have to be restored eventually and so on.
Yes, and the service has to keep on going. There's only one part of it. And then there's all the press and the TV and the politicians, and you have to talk to all the train operators. You talk to your contractors. So it's a very intense.
Did you find the press aspect difficult?
Yes, because because it's horrific. And the first thing it's the press on the Wednesday was just reporting on this horrific accident and everything, and then the Wednesday evening, I went on the 9 o'clock news with Survivor and with someone from the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, and the Health and Safety Executive guy explained about what had happened and the safety record of the railway, which has been quite good and been steadily improving. And the survivor then talked about what had happened to him, which was very, very personal. He was in the third carriage, I think, and all those details. And then John Sissons then turns to me, because I'm I'm from the train company, and how did this manage to happen? What went wrong? Blah blah blah. So no, it was difficult. But you can't hide. You have to talk, and you got all these people working for you that have to be motivated and keep pressing on. And you got to try and preserve what confidence there is in the rail network. And it is quite.
In the book, you say something rather interesting about this. That the XBR people kind of had a better instinct of how to handle this than the people who'd come from the private sector.
Yes, so yes, that's right. It was very disappointing. The people that came from the private sector could only think of it in terms of what had happened to them, what it meant for them, and they didn't want to go anywhere near it in terms of helping. Or they, to be honest, they're headed for the hills.
Right.
Whereas the old railway people, there was Chris Lair, our operations director, in the boardroom managing the response. There was, for example, Dick Fern, who was ran our Midlands area. I remember he got buttonholed by a TV crew at Paddington Station. What had happened, and he took it on the chin and said what he thought, and was very fluent in an interview. So the railway people, they moved towards the gunfire, whereas the non-railway people, on the whole, they were one of them.
That's interesting. I mean, now, and in terms of responsibility, clearly the immediate responsibility was that the Thames train went through a red light. We know that, but past a red signal at danger. But in the book, again, you outline that some of the way that the railway was fragmented contributed towards that. In what way was that?
Well, after a couple of days, it became clearer what had happened. It was as bad. By the time we got to Thursday, when we went in to see Prescott, the Deputy Prime Minister, we'd gone down the drains on everything, and there had been 60 signals past the danger in the Paddington Throat in the previous, I think it was 8 years.
Yes.
And that was all to do with the fact that the layouts had become far more complex with the Heathrow Express being put on. So the signals had got more complex, and the drivers were learning.
And most of those are spads of just a few yards, but never.
Almost every spad is just a couple of yards, and the driver realizes where he is and stops.
But nevertheless, there was a pattern that wasn't followed.
There was a pattern that it was a problem, but what was interesting was that in the previous year before Ladbroke Grove, the number of SPADs had dropped to one, just one, because the action had been taken. And the most significant action was they removed what's called the flashing yellows from a number of the signals, and the flashing yellows were causing extra complexity. And that meant the number of SPADs crashed right down. And so the zone, I think, felt that to a large extent the problem had been solved. But it did turn out there'd been a very bad SPAD at that signal 109 a year and a half previously. And there'd been every SPAD results in a review, obviously. And at the review of the SPAD, a series of recommendations were made, but not all the recommendations had been carried through. One of them was to have a signal siting committee, and that had not been carried through, which was not good. And the red alert didn't go through the zone because the number of SPADs had come right down before, but it hadn't happened. And if the signal siting committee had taken place, they might have picked up that the signal wasn't quite right, given what had happened with the Heathrow Express and those changes, and they might have changed the signal, and that might have made the signal a bit more visible because it was a very bright morning and whatever. What was happening with the drivers? And the other thing, of course, is all the train operators were adding drivers because of the growth in the network. So you had all these new drivers, and the changes in their driver training program in response to the privatisation that increased the risk at the same time as the complexity from the Heathrow Express. And I think back under BR, someone might have put those two things together. But because of the private and for risk going up, and rarely and might have done something. It's all hypothetical. But of course, in the privatized railway, everyone just looks after their own bit. And one of the train operators at Great Western had complained to our zone about why more progress wasn't being made on action on signal siting committees and so on, and that had gone into the zone at quite a junior level, and it had gone into someone who was a commercial person in charge of the contracts, whereas under BR it might have been that complaint might have been picked up. So it
who knows? Yeah, so there were pointers to the.
There is absolutely no question that splitting the railway into 100 different bits and the fragmentation and tying it together in contracts, combined with the sudden growth that we were facing, that hadn't been anticipated, that did make the thing a management nightmare.
It put pressure on you.
It put huge pressure on.
And so we get the Cullen report, and do you think that was...
Well, first of all we had the meeting with Prescott on the Thursday, which sort of was okay, and he'd announced the Cullen inquiry, and we understood all that. And then on the Saturday, there was a meeting at number 10, which Railtrack rather teddingly wasn't asked to. And and then the briefing that came out of that for the Sunday papers was that there was a report coming out on the Monday on our safety and standards department. And that was going to be result in the department's reporting lines being changed, and the wording was that Railtrack was to be stripped of its safety responsibilities.
That was it never happened, of course. But you managed to survive. You managed to stay on as CEO, and
like pressure. Oh yes, I mean on the Sundays the News of the World and the Sunday Mirror were calling for my resignation. And I did go around all the TV studios, went on the Frost program, Dimbleby, at the Today program, all of that, making the company's points, which were that the signal was working perfectly well, and everything. The railway safety record had improved, and lots of people, that thousands of trains had stopped at that signal, and it was all very sad. And making some of the company's points, because I was very conscious that, well, first of all, that we didn't want the public blaming Railtrack, because there's 3 million people go on it every day. There's the 11,000 people that work through Railtrack, because as a result of the vilification, because all over the Sundays there was stuff about corporate manslaughter, and all of that. And then we had reports that bricks were being thrown through signal box windows, that signalers were being spat at in newsagents.
Oh my God.
And you had this was all. So I did feel it was necessary to get out there and make our case, which I did, and it wasn't very pleasant, but we did it and we got through it. And 3 weeks later, well, the other problem we had was that on the Thursday, 2 days after the crash, the British Transport Police were briefing that 100 people might be dead because they hadn't been able to clear out carriage 8.
That's right. I mean, I covered it in great. I was in every studio at the time because I was a freelance by then, and there was kept on being this speculation about that there might be lots of bodies in that carriage 8, which there weren't.
Well, they didn't know because the fear was that people would have moved up the Great Western Train as it came to get off, and because they hadn't cleared carriage age, they didn't know, and there were all these cars still parked in Reading car park.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the British, and that would have made it the worst transport disaster since the Titanic or something.
Not
that
since Harrow, but anyway, it was
for a long time, and that was the background to the government's the government's briefing.
Right.
But by the time we got to the following week, it was the death toll was all still gas. It was 31. The wreckage had been cleared, and the pool of smoke going up over Maida Vale was gone away, and it took 3 weeks to get it back to normal. But it was, and then we had quite a productive period because we formed this. Prescott led this safety, this safety. I can't remember what it was called, safety recovery group or something. And we made the director of operations, we made him the director of safety, and we made a whole series of changes, and we doubled the investment, and we accelerated the train protection warning system. We put all the safety measures into the bonus of everybody, because previously it hadn't been the bonus, because the thinking had been that it's a given, not a variable. But of course, if you do put it into the bonus, and
it incentivizes people.
So we did a lot, and then over the next year, the number of signals past the danger dropped by 30%. We got on top of broken rails because they decreased hugely as a result of the increase in the traffic after the privatisation. And we would in 1999 we reduced that by over 30%. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that in 1998, that was the first year since 1902 that there hadn't been a passenger death in a train crash on the railway.
Right.
And the safety record had been getting better. So that was that was.
And then you get the Cullen report where you had to give evidence. I remember seeing you around then, and that was a hard time.
Yes, that was difficult. Yes, because you get all the survivor groups in the court and hissing you and no, that was difficult, but we got through it.
And so then, as you say, you had a reasonably productive period, and then
well, I remember. Yeah, I know what you're going to say, Titian. Yeah, one of the last things before Hatfield, which was on the October the 15th. Early October, we had the breaking through session on the Channel Tunnel rail link. And I went down at the end of September. I went down with Prescott on the train.
Right.
And that's the moment in the North Downs when they're tunneling under the North Downs, and the two tunneling machines break through a leafy giant.
Right.
And they make a big thing of it. So and Prescott made rather a good speech, actually. We went down together and came back together. And we had one of our better conversations. And I remember him saying, he said, well, he's getting better now, it's good. And everything, and indicating that the regulator would give us more money, and change the architecture and the incentives and sort out a lot of those programs. And that was good news. But he said, I don't know what the hell would do if there's another one.
And there was.
Yeah, there was.
And this was, in a way, worse for you because it was a rail track problem.
Well, it was a big, yes.
It was a broken rail.
Yeah, the train crashed at 1 o'clock in the afternoon at Hatfield. It was the a GNER train going north, 90 miles an hour, and derailed, and 4 people died, and there were 40 people injured.
So that was down to Railtrack.
Well, it was, and it ended up 4 years later, after all the court cases and the investigations and everything. It was at its heart, it was sloppy maintenance. The track had been identified as needing renewing.
Gauge corner cracking became famous, and the whole. But I mean, the impact of that was that the train slowed down massively. 'Cause, I mean, I called it, that the trains around Britain stopped.
Well, it was a broken rail, and it was due to gauge corner cracking, and the rail should have been changed, and it hadn't been changed because the contractor, a series of complicated reasons, but normally
So why wasn't it changed?
it wasn't the new rail was by the track.
Yes, ready to know on.
But ready to go on. But the possession to do the work hadn't been given, and for a variety of detailed reasons, it hadn't happened in the April and been delayed.
Right.
But the trains, so there was no speed restriction put on, which was the real problem, and the rail had just sat there, and the last resort safety measure on the maintenance is the track patrolling system. And the track patrolling system is a physical thing, and back in the day, 3 people used to do it, and every week would walk the main lines.
Not any longer, but yes.
Not to make sure it was all okay.
Right.
And that had been cut back, which actually meant that they were patrolling from what's called the cess, which is the side of the track. So they couldn't actually see the rails on the top of the track. And if they'd preserved the manpower that they had preserved before the privatisation, then they would have seen that that a speed restriction had to go on. So for a whole series of reasons, a speed restriction hadn't been put on. Patrolling had been changed, and the rail was in awful shape, and bingo. And that combined with and then what do we do? And the conclusion our engineers came to very quickly, well, obviously, was that we had to check everything.
Across the whole network.
And you have to do that. And the engineers were unbelievably nervous because of what had happened post Lambert Road, and all this talk about corporate manslaughter and all of that. And of course, under the safety case, it is the track engineers.
And while you did the checks, there were speed restrictions placed around the network. I mean, the whole network was.
Well, he's put we had a big problem that a lot of the engineering expertise was with the maintenance contractor. So David pulled them in, and I can remember the meetings, about 20 of them in a meeting, and everything. And David had 2 lawyers there, because if he got it wrong, they could have all. And there was another crash. They would have all been, and people were prosecuted post Hatfield, but they could have been it could have been really serious. So they developed a new set of guidelines that any rail with a crack of more than 30 millimeters in it had to have a speed restriction on it immediately of 20 mph, which was quite draconian. But
I remember 7-hour journeys to Nottingham.
Oh, it was awful.
Yes.
And when they did that, because the data on the state of the track was with the maintenance contractors, and because there wasn't an asset register, BR didn't have one either, and we didn't have one. The regulator had been on to us about it, and it was in the list of the to-do list, but there wasn't one. I still don't think they got one today.
No.
Because of the lack of an asset register, no one really knew how many speed restrictions would go on, and their best estimate was 300, and 3 weeks later there were 1,800. And because everyone in the maintenance contractors, everyone acted so cautiously. And I can remember this professor, whose name escapes me, who was doing a report on it all, saying the engineers have stopped making engineering judgments. They're all absolutely petrified, and you could understand why.
So then you came under a lot of pressure over that.
Well, because it was crystal clear on the crash was at 1 o'clock. By 7 o'clock that evening, we knew it was a broken rail, and I concluded then that I'd have to resign.
Oh, really?
Yes, because the position I'd taken on Ladbroke Road was that the signal was working perfectly properly. And I'd actually gone on the record as saying that if the signal hadn't been working properly and it had been on, of course I'd have resigned. Because you are chief executive, you are accountable. It may not be your fault, but you are accountable, and that's one reason why you get paid all this money, and all the rest of it. And because I'd taken that position, I thought it was the right thing to do, but I should tender my resignation.
But they didn't let you resign. They really didn't.
Well, we got it confirmed late that evening, and then the following morning, the chairman wasn't there because he was in America, but he was coming back for the board meeting. I resigned, and it was quite weird, really. There was a sort of silence, and nothing much happened. And I had a cup of coffee, and then wandered across the Eastern Concourse. And by the time I got back, there was a list of people calling me, saying because people suddenly realised that actually, the chief executive going isn't necessarily going to do any good.
Yes.
And it's not the chief executive job to patrol the track or even make sure that the really detailed level that all the faults are proper.
Well, especially as it was subcontractors, it were.
Yeah, and all, and I got and people, when they thought about it, they had appreciated all the work we'd done in the previous couple of years, and they appreciated all the difficulties of the privatisation. And I got a lot of political support as well. Number 10 went on the record as saying Mr. Corbett's doing an important job at a difficult time. And the Mirror was because the Mirror, of course, was the mouthpiece of Number 10.
Yeah.
And the Mirror was very supportive, and Pam Warren from Paddington Survivors Group was supportive, and all the train operators. So my resignation was rejected by the board, and we got on with it. But it was and we then had a very, very busy month with select committees and with the rail program
and all these speed restrictions, kind of, and having been gradually coming off.
And we mustn't forget the weather, because it was the West of October.
Oh, right, and
40 years or something incredible. So it was a very difficult period. And everything, and then just as things were getting a bit better, and we were getting some light, because Number 10 got very involved with the replacement plan, because the railway wasn't working properly. It was awful. And then, as I described in the book, I was then I was suddenly asked to leave,
right. How long after?
A month after.
Right. So at one point they asked you to stay, and then they asked you to leave.
Yes, and yes, and I remember asking. I said, "What is that?"
So who asked you to leave?
Oh, the chairman did. Well, he said the board had decided it was best for me to leave.
The chairman being
Sir Philip Beck,
right.
who's a perfectly decent chap and chaired the meetings very nicely and everything. I said, "Well, Philip," I said, "I don't mind going." I said, "Is it right? Should I go now? Is it right to go now?" Whatever. I said, has there been political pressure? No, he said. I said, has there been pressure from the regulators? No, he said. With the train operators? No. The shareholders? No. And I said, well, why are we doing this? And he just said, well, everyone's attacking us, and we think it will lance the boil. So I said, well, I said, I'm sorry, Philip. I think you'll find they'll attack you even more. And he said, well, that's where we've got to. And of course, the reality is, if you haven't got their support,
the chairman,
the chairman of the board, you can't do the job. But I was a bit surprised that they supported me a month before, and then they changed their mind. And I guess it would be easier if suddenly the railway had got better and all the problems had been sorted out, and then I could have said, well, that's fair enough.
So you left when exactly?
Exactly. I left on the 15th of November.
So is that right?
A month after the crash, yes. And then what happened out, and that wasn't very nice, because the chairman said, I didn't know why I'm laughing. I said, well, when are we going to announce this? And he said, well, we'd like to announce it immediately. That's what the PR people advise. And I said, well, what reason are we going to give? And he said, well, we'd like you to give the reason that it's been an exhausting period and you decided to take a break. And so I said, well, that's not the truth at all. And he said, well, the problem is that if we say that we've asked you to leave, there's a risk that some people might attack us. And so I said, I think this is a really bad idea. And you giving that kind of a reason and me giving it, it's not true. And I'm not comfortable with that. Do you mind if I just go and reflect on it? So I went and reflected on it, and I rang our advisor, and he said, the truth will get out. Because I was worried that people would think I was just leaving it and I've had enough. He said, well, he said the truth will get out. He said, but this actually will be a better way of doing it for the company and for you, because at least if they do it this way, and everything, they'll be able to say nice things about you and the job you've done. Whereas if you say that you've been asked to leave, they'll have to give reasons why you've been asked to leave. And that will be very difficult for them because they supported you a month ago, and they've supported all the actions that you've taken since then. So I went along with this, and
So you basically said, "Oh, I need a rest."
yeah, it was terrible, Christian. I remember saying we were going to India for a holiday. So there I was with the network in a complete mess. It's like privatisation and anyway. And what happened subsequently? In the next year, the company stopped trying to be part of the solution, and it just became more and more of a problem.
And essentially, this was the end of Railtrack, really, because then the crazy thing, and I remember challenging Steve Marshall on this on the platform we used in the station, is that they paid a dividend.
They did, yes,
But the share price was plummeting, and you'd made a great loss, of course, because of the
fragmentation. Yeah,
they lost £400 million, and they paid a dividend, and that was really the last straw. I mean, would you have done that?
No. The reality was that because of the regulatory review, we were getting a 50% increase in the money we were getting.
That is right, from 5 billion to 10.
And I think, and that, I think the thing to have done would be to have got the network working again, and got to there. I would have gone on with the second phase of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link because it was
a bonus. It was a positive.
Yes, and the first phase one had gone very, very well. And then to the extent there needed to be discussions about the West Coast Main Line and other things, I'd have had them when we got a new chairman. The reality was I did have to go because if there's been 2 train crashes on your watch that you've had to deal with in a very public way, it's just not sustainable if there's a third. Right. So I would have had to go, but I think
of course there was a third a couple of years later at Potter's Bar.
Yeah, and can you imagine if I still been in charge then? I mean, it was
so that, but I mean that basically killed off Railtrack, didn't it? Or I mean, between
I think what killed it off was the fact that they didn't perform. The continual requests for money, the paying the dividend, and then Byers hatched his plan.
And put it into administration.
And even then, they could have stopped it by not agreeing to the order. The order was issued on a Sunday. And if they'd rung up Tom Windsor, the regulator, and asked for an interim regulatory review, he'd have had to give it because it was his duty to make sure the company had enough money. And they could have got through to the Monday, by which time the markets would have been opened. They could have fought it. But they didn't.
Remember this.
They just signed it, and it was like they'd given up completely. And that was all very sad. So and all the shareholders' money and all the effort that had gone into it all, and everything all for nothing.
But do you think ultimately, and you hint at this in the book, that a privatized Railtrack was not a good idea? I mean, that ultimately, was it a viable concept? I mean, I remember at the time thinking that, talking to Japanese people who said, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't privatize the infrastructure because there is no kind of real business called infrastructure. It's entirely dependent on trains running on it."
I think it would have had more chance if the maintenance hadn't been privatized. I think we might have got through, but it would have been much easier if it hadn't been privatized at all. And I think it was the great rush to do it all that was the problem. Because if they hadn't privatized it and they'd just done the train operators, and then taken it gradually, then the extra complexity and the fragmentation of it wouldn't have been nearly as serious, and it would have been easier to manage, and the railway could have got used to that, and then you might have done something a bit more with Railtrack. But you'd always had the problem of the big subsidy, and the real problem was the politics. Because back in the day when there was a minister and BR effectively reported to the minister would never hang BR out to dry because he was responsible for it. But actually it was the vilification post Ladbroke Grove that made the thing unmanageable post Hatfield.
That Railtrack getting the blame.
Railtrack getting the blame, and that was the real problem. Whereas a train operator, because there was 30 of them, if one of them had been vilified by the government, it wouldn't have really mattered. So I think it would have stood more chance without the maintenance, I think it would have worked if it had been kept in the public sector, which is sort of where it is today. And none of it would have happened. What I would have liked to have seen though is the old Big Four integrated railways that privatized, because that was
John Major's idea. Yes.
Well, that would have, you'd have had the integrated railway. If one bit was gone wrong and been vilified, it wouldn't have affected the entire
whole second house. Yeah.
Yes, and then you could have had the regulator comparing and contrasting, and it would have been easier to manage because there would have been different interfaces, but it would have been. And I think what may happen in the future is that because they're putting it all back in now, and I know there's this open access, which I hope that it will continue with, because it does seem to have something going for it. But I'm sure eventually, I don't know, 10, 15 years time, the problems of a big utility reporting to a minister and annual controls from the Treasury and all the old problems that BR battled with, someone else will come up with another solution. And I hope then that the Big Four comes back. And you see, you could just do one bit of the country and see how that went and everything, and you could do it gradually, because that was the other thing. It was all done in such a great rush. I mean, it's amazing that the thing did as well as
it was. Even though I was against it, I was impressed with the administrative capability of it, and I think that was thanks a lot to the very skilled British rail managers.
Yes, I agree.
Like Chris Green and Middleton.
Well, BR
there as people.
Yes, BR had a bloody good graduate trainee program, and they held it together. They're the real heroes of the whole thing. We wouldn't have had a railway without.
No, absolutely, and I did write that in my book on British Rail. But just to finish off, Gerald, did you enjoy your? I mean, despite all problems, did you enjoy your time in the railways? And you know, are you pleased you actually did that?
Yes, I am.
Really,
right. So you learn much more when things go wrong than when they go right.
Right.
And I learned a hell of a lot. And the railwaymen were tremendous. And although awful things, the crashes were awful. Yeah.
You subscribe to a public sector ethos in a way, that you liked the public sector of serving people.
It grew on me.
Right.
Yeah. And they were bloody good people, working really hard and in the right sort of way, and worshipping the right gods, and that was that was good.
And so you wish Great British Railways well?
Yes. They you know what they say in life, you're either successful or you learn a lot. Well, no, I do wish Great British Railways well, and of course, and I think the old problems will reoccur, and was what I said a moment ago, and it would be nice to try and make some progress on if they do it again, which I think they will eventually. It should be as an integrated railway. That was a big problem.
I've always argued that. Well, thank you, Gerald. That's an absolute terrific interview. I'm sure our listeners will have a lot of food for thought there, but thanks ever so much. That's a very frank and fascinating interview.
Here's Christian's final thought from the departure lounge.
Well, that was a very enlightening interview. And I have an abiding memory of the day that the Ladbroke Grove crash happened, because I was called to give an interview for Sky News from the roof of a warehouse opposite the site. And there was this horrible picture of the the Thames train that had been ripped apart by the other train. And it had a whole half of its carriage was on top of the remains of the Great Western train. And it was kind of hanging there, kind of looming over it. And it was just, you just realized that, lots of people had died there, and there'd been a fire and a conflagration. And it really was just so horrific. And the memory stays with me as if I could remember it, as if it happened yesterday. So, these events were tumultuous. I think it's maybe difficult for some listeners, younger listeners, to realize just how fraught this period was, with not only the breakup of the industry and all the chaos that kind of resulted from that, the fragmentation, and some people making a lot of money, other people find themselves without jobs and so on, but also the ghastly accidents that then ensued, and the aftermath actually, remained hanging over the industry really for a decade or so. And it's only recently that we've forgotten that these terrible things happened. So I think this is a great reminder of the mistakes that were made at the time, and of the events that took place. And I think I find Gerald's interview both pretty honest and very revealing.
Thank you for listening to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Warmar, which is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please do consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media. You can find Cogitamus Limited, Calling All Stations podcast, Christian Warmar and Mark Walker across a variety of platforms, including LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky and X.